John Harris stood in the middle of the gleaming engineering bay, feeling like a speck of dirt in a museum. All around him, translucent control panels floated, humming softly with a low, rhythmic vibration. The air smelled faintly metallic, and every surface in the room was polished to a mirror sheen. The Galgorians, their tall, insected forms moving with fluid grace, worked silently, their expressions hidden behind reflective visors. Zarin, the head of the Galgorian Engineering Corps, towered over him, his iridescent exoskeleton glinting under the cold lights. "I still don't understand why we need you," Zarin said, his voice carrying a barely concealed sneer. "We've scanned the graviton engine 3 times. No errors. The ship is in perfect condition." John didn't bother looking up. His hands worked, methodically tracing the outlines of the ship's graviton core, feeling for any imperfection. He wasn't intimidated by the advanced technology surrounding him, though it was far beyond anything Earth had produced. It was just another machine, and machines, no matter how advanced, broke. "Look," John said, pulling a small, greasy wrench from his tool belt. The tool looked comically out of place in the sterile, futuristic setting. "Sometimes it's not about what your scanners can pick up. It's about what you can feel. A slight misalignment, a loose connection, your tech can't catch that." Zarin's mandibles clicked in irritation. "Primitive nonsense. This ship was built with the most advanced technology in the galaxy. Your wrench won't do anything." John paused, looking at the Galgorian, who loomed over him with thinly veiled contempt. He'd seen this before. Aliens, especially the ones with more advanced tech, always assumed humans were backward because they relied on simple tools. "Tell you what," John said, adjusting his grip on the wrench. "If I can't fix it in 10 minutes, I'll leave, and you can get back to watching your screens do nothing." Zarin's eyes flicked from the wrench to the core, and then back to John. The room was filled with the soft hum of Galgorian tech, a stark contrast to the quiet clinks of John's manual inspection. "Fine," Zarin said, crossing his arms. 10 minutes. John gave a half-smile and crouched beside the engine. He ran his hand along the metallic surface, feeling for even the smallest imperfection. The graviton engine was a masterpiece, no doubt. Smooth, polished, and infinitely more efficient than anything humans had developed. But as with all complex systems, the more moving parts, the more room for error. There. His fingers paused over a small, nearly imperceptible dent. The kind of thing no machine would detect but could cause a cascade of errors down the line. John leaned in, squinting to get a better look. With a careful twist of his wrench, he nudged the metal back into place. The Galgorian engineers watching him from across the room remained silent, their postures stiff, clearly skeptical of his every move. But John wasn't concerned about them. He was concerned about the engine. "Simple mechanics," he muttered to himself. "If it bends, it can break." Another twist, a tightening here, a slight adjustment there. The ship groaned softly in response, a sound no one else seemed to notice. John straightened, stepping back to assess his work. The wrench dangled from his hand as he stared at the core. For a moment, the room was still. And then, with a deep, resonating hum, the engine roared back to life. The glow from the engine bathed the room in warm light as it spun up, systems coming online in perfect harmony. The Galgorian techs blinked at their consoles, visibly startled. Zarin's mandibles clicked rapidly in what could only be disbelief. What did you do?" John shrugged, wiping a bit of grease off his hands with a rag. "Like I said, it was just a minor misalignment. Your scanners were too busy looking for something complicated to notice what was right in front of them." Zarin stepped forward, staring at the now fully functional engine. "But your tools are so basic. We've advanced beyond such methods centuries ago." "Maybe that's your problem," John said, sliding the wrench back into his belt. "You've gotten so advanced, you've forgotten how to fix things when they're simple." He gave a casual glance around the room. "Machines are great. But sometimes you need a human touch." The tension in the room was palpable. The Galgorians, so sure of their superiority, now stood in quiet amazement as their once silent, lifeless starship thrummed with energy. Zarin turned to John, his posture slightly less rigid. I don't understand. Why did our systems miss this? How could something so simple be the answer? John smiled, leaning back against the bulkhead. Because sometimes it's not the tool that matters. It's the person using it. He gestured at the gleaming panels. You can have all the tech in the world, but if you can't see the small things, the things your machines ignore, well, you end up with a broken ship. Zarin remained silent for a moment, staring at the engine as if reevaluating everything he knew. His hands flexed as if searching for the right response. Perhaps, he said slowly, we've been too reliant on our systems. Maybe, John replied, pushing off the bulkhead. Or maybe you just need someone like me to remind you that sometimes, the old ways still work. The room was silent again, but this time, there was no tension. Only a quiet understanding, a shift in perspective. Zarin met John's gaze and, for the first time, gave a small nod of respect. John turned to leave, tossing the rag over his shoulder. Glad I could help, he said, pausing at the door. Call me if your fancy systems break down again. As he walked away, the hum of the ship's engine filled the space, steady and strong. John Harris stood at the observation deck of the Galorian ship, the endless stretch of space outside the window framing the silence between him and Zarin. The hum of the recently repaired graviton engine filled the room like a steady heartbeat, but it wasn't enough to break the tension that hung in the air. So, Zarin began, his voice tight. You fixed it. The ship is running smoothly. He paused, clearly searching for the right words. Yet I find myself unsettled. John turned to look at him, leaning casually against the polished metal railing. Unsettled? Because a wrench did what your tech couldn't. Zarin's mandibles twitched slightly, a sign of discomfort. Because it shouldn't have happened. Our systems are designed to be flawless, to detect every anomaly. And yet here we are. You solved a problem we didn't even know existed. That unnerves me. John smiled faintly, understanding the pride that Zarin was trying to hold on to. Tech is only as good as the people who use it. You can have the best systems in the universe, but if you forget how to actually feel what's going on, you're blind to the obvious. Zarin's reflective visor faced John, as unreadable as ever. Are you saying we've grown lazy? John shook his head. Not lazy. Just too dependent. You've got great tools, don't get me wrong. But you forgot how to get your hands dirty. Sometimes you need to get in there, feel the bolts, listen to the machine. The Galorian leader's silence spoke volumes. He wasn't used to questioning their way of life, much less taking advice from a human. But the evidence was there, humming softly beneath their feet, and even Zarin couldn't ignore it. It's not just the tools, is it? Zarin asked, more to himself than to John. It's how we see things. We've overcomplicated our solutions. John didn't need to say anything. The truth was in the air between them, and Zarin could feel it. Just then, the doors slid open with a quiet hiss, and a junior Galorian engineer scuttled in, his eyes wide. Sir, we've encountered another anomaly, he said, barely able to hide the tension in his voice. The graviton stabilizer in the rear bay is malfunctioning. We can't pinpoint the cause. Zarin's mandibles clicked together. What do the diagnostics say? They're not showing anything, sir, the junior engineer replied, his voice tight. It's reading as normal, but the stabilizer is fluctuating. John raised an eyebrow, straightening up. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Zarin's exhale sounded like a soft hiss. Let's go. They moved swiftly through the corridors, the soft glow of Galorian technology casting a pale light on the metallic walls. John followed Zarin in silence, his mind already turning over the possibilities. It was a different problem, but he had a feeling it would be more of the same, over-reliance on machines to catch what they couldn't. When they reached the rear bay, a team of engineers was already gathered, their sleek instruments scanning the graviton stabilizer with increasing frustration. The stabilizer itself, a massive, cylindrical mechanism, was pulsing irregularly, its usually steady rhythm erratic and uneven. Zarin stepped forward, his voice commanding. Report. Everything appears normal, one of the engineers said, glancing up from his console. No signs of malfunction, but the stabilizer is clearly unstable. John moved past them, walking up to the massive stabilizer. He placed a hand on the cool metal surface, feeling the subtle vibrations beneath his fingertips. It was off, slightly, but enough to matter. He walked around the stabilizer, eyes scanning for anything out of place. The engineers watched him, some in curiosity, others in outright disbelief. You won't find anything by touch, one of the Galgorians muttered under his breath, but John ignored him. His hands found a small panel near the base of the stabilizer, and with a practiced flick, he opened it, revealing the inner workings. Zaren's voice was low. What are you doing? John pulled out a small light and leaned in closer. Looking for what your machines can't see. He squinted, running a finger along a set of wires that led directly to the stabilizer's core. Here we go. He pulled a wrench from his belt and carefully adjusted the wires, tightening them just slightly. Loose connection, he muttered. Probably happened when you hit turbulence earlier. The stabilizer's sensitive, and these wires aren't designed to shift even a millimeter. There was a pause. Then, as John tightened the final wire, the stabilizer's rhythm smoothed out, returning to its steady, even pulse. The engineers blinked at their consoles, watching as the stabilizer's readings normalized instantly. Zaren stepped forward, his mandibles clicking softly in thought. You just fixed it? Like that? John stood up, wiping his hands on his pants. Like I said, sometimes you've got to get your hands dirty. Your systems are advanced, no doubt about it. But they're not perfect. Zaren stared at the stabilizer for a long moment, as if reassessing everything he had been taught. We built systems to remove error, to make everything precise. And yet, here we are, relying on human hands to correct what our technology missed. John chuckled softly. Technology's great, Zaren. It makes life easier, but it doesn't replace intuition. You've been taught to trust your systems, but sometimes the best tool is a pair of hands. The room was silent, the soft hum of the stabilizer now a quiet reminder of the simplicity that had just saved the day. Zaren's posture relaxed, his mandibles twitching in a way John hadn't seen before. Acceptance, maybe, or something close to it. We have much to learn, Zaren admitted quietly. More than I expected. John gave him a nod. Everyone does. Just remember, sometimes the solution's right in front of you. You've just got to know where to look. As they left the bay, John couldn't help but smile. He'd come to this ship expecting resistance, and he'd found it in spades. But now, he was starting to see the cracks in the Galgorians' pride, and maybe, just maybe, they were beginning to understand that advanced tech wasn't everything. It was a small step, but it was a start. The door slid shut behind them, and the hum of the stabilizer echoed softly in the distance, as steady as the new rhythm of understanding that had begun to form. John sat in the Galgorian engineering bay, hunched over a cup of dark, bitter liquid that passed for coffee on this ship. The silence was palpable, only broken by the low hum of the ship's engines. He'd gotten used to the quiet on these alien vessels, the way it seemed to press in on you, cold and calculating, as if the ship itself was watching your every move. It was nothing like the noisy chaos of an Earth ship. Zaren approached, his mandibles clicking softly as he took a seat across from John. There was something different about him today, a tension in his posture that hadn't been there before. The Council has called for a demonstration, Zaren said, his voice low. They want to see your methods firsthand. John raised an eyebrow, sipping the bitter drink. A demonstration? Of what? How to tighten a bolt? Zaren's mandibles twitched, and John could almost sense the discomfort behind that visor. Of human mechanics. They want to understand how you fixed the ship when our systems failed. The Council doesn't believe it should have been possible. John leaned back, setting the cup down with a soft clink. They don't think it should be possible because they can't admit they missed something. Your tech's good, Zaren, but it's not perfect. Nothing is. The alien engineer sat still for a moment, then nodded slowly. They will not accept that answer. They need proof. John sighed, running a hand through his hair. So what's the plan? I perform a magic trick in front of your council? Zarin didn't smile, though John had given up expecting it. There's a damaged vessel nearby. An older model. The council has arranged for us to be transported there. They want you to repair it. And you're coming with me? John asked. Yes, Zarin replied. I insisted. There was a weight behind his words that John didn't miss. Zarin wasn't just tagging along for the ride. He was walking into this situation knowing it could go south quickly if the council didn't like what they saw. The journey to the damaged ship was short, but the tension aboard their transport was thick. Zarin sat across from John in the small cabin, his usual silence feeling heavier than before. John tried not to think too much about it, focusing instead on what lay ahead. When they arrived at the derelict vessel, it was clear this wasn't just some run-of-the-mill repair job. The ship was ancient by Galorian standards, a hulking mass of metal and wires that had long since fallen out of use. The moment John set foot aboard, the stale air hit him, dusty and old, like the ship hadn't been touched in years. The council members, a small group of elite Galorians, were already there, waiting in the observation bay. Their gleaming exoskeletons reflected the dim light, giving them an almost ethereal presence in the old ship's corridors. They greeted Zarin with a respectful nod before turning their gaze on John. The scrutiny was immediate, their eyes narrowing as if they were evaluating every inch of him. "This is the human mechanic?" one of them asked, his voice smooth but cold. Zarin stepped forward. "Yes. He repaired the Empyrean when our systems failed. I've asked him to do the same here." The council members exchanged glances, clearly skeptical. John, for his part, wasn't interested in impressing them. He just wanted to get the job done. He approached the ship's central core, examining it with a practiced eye. It was a mess. Decades of disuse had left the wiring tangled and the connections loose. "All right," John muttered to himself, reaching for his wrench. "Let's see what we've got here." The council members watched in silence as John worked. His hands moved quickly, expertly untangling wires and tightening connections where the ship's systems had deteriorated. He felt the subtle vibrations in the metal, listening for the clues no machine could hear. "What is he doing?" one of the council members whispered, his voice full of disbelief. Zarin answered softly, his voice betraying a hint of pride. "He's using his hands." As John continued his work, the tension in the room grew. The council members, who had begun the demonstration with thinly veiled disdain, were now watching with something closer to awe. Slowly but surely, the ship's systems began to hum to life, lights flickering on and control panels sparking back to functionality. Finally, John stood up, wiping the sweat from his brow. "There," he said, stepping back from the core. "That should do it." The council members stared at the newly reactivated systems, their disbelief palpable. One of them stepped forward, inspecting the core with an intensity that made John smirk. "It is functioning," the counselor admitted reluctantly. "But how?" John shrugged. "Simple mechanics. Sometimes your tech gets so complicated that it overlooks the basics. You can build the best ship in the galaxy, but if you don't keep an eye on the little things, it'll fall apart just the same." Zarin turned to the council, his voice calm but firm. "This is what I've been trying to explain. Our systems are advanced, but they are not flawless. Human intuition, combined with simple mechanics, can fill the gaps we didn't even know existed." The counselor who had spoken earlier crossed his arms, clearly struggling to accept the truth. "This cannot be the future of Galorian engineering. We are the pinnacle of technology. We do not need to revert to. We need to adapt." Zarin interrupted, his voice steady. "Our pride has blinded us to the advantages others may offer. The solution is not to ignore what works. It is to learn from it." There was a long pause. The council members stood in quiet contemplation, their rigid postures softening ever so slightly. John glanced at Zarin, impressed by the shift in his tone. Zarin had always been proud of Galorian technology, but now he stood here, defending the very methods they had once dismissed. Finally, One of the counselors nodded slowly. Perhaps there is merit to this. John couldn't help but chuckle. Took you long enough. As the group filed out of the derelict ship, John felt a strange sense of satisfaction. He hadn't just fixed a ship, he'd proven that sometimes, simplicity was the key to survival in a world drowning in complexity. The council was far from fully convinced, but the cracks in their pride were starting to show. As they boarded the transport back to the Empyrean, Zarin turned to John, a quiet gratitude in his voice. You've changed more than just this ship today. John smiled, looking out at the stars as they sped through the void. Yeah, he said softly. I guess I did.